Submit now, and Persia will rebuild your city greater than it ever was.
Tell your king that as long as the sun holds its course, Athens will never make peace with Persia.
They refuse, my lord. They said Athens will burn 1,000 times before it kneels.
Then let us see how they enjoy the second burning.
The year is 409 BCE, and you are standing in the largest Greek army ever assembled, waiting in silence on a hillside above the plain of Plataea. Look down the line beside you, and you will count more than 100,000 Greeks, more than this land had ever gathered before this single morning, and more than it would ever gather again. Now look the other way, down onto the open plain, where everything Xerxes left behind when he ran from Salamis is waiting for you instead. The man responsible for every single one of those 100,000 lives isn't even a king in his own right. He is a regent standing in for a boy still too young to lead an army this size himself. And not everyone standing on that plain is your enemy in the way you think, because some of the men down there are Greek too, are standing on the other side entirely. Your hand tightens around the spear shaft, and somewhere further down that long line, a horn has still not sounded. Not yet. For 8 long days now, both of these massive armies have stood exactly like this, close enough to see each other clearly, and by the time this story ends, you'll understand exactly why neither side was willing to move first. Beside almost every Spartan in that line stands an Athenian who has genuinely never fought a battle of this size before, and it clearly shows on his face. Today, after 8 days of silence, that stillness finally breaks, and nothing on this plain will ever be still again. After Salamis, Xerxes I marched home with most of his army, unwilling to risk another personal defeat, leaving Mardonius behind with a smaller force to finish conquering Greece on his behalf. So Mardonius tried something Xerxes had never once bothered with, talking Athens into surrendering peacefully instead of simply marching in and burning the city to the ground a second time. He sent a Greek king allied to Persia to deliver the offer himself, gambling that a familiar face speaking their own language would make surrender easier for Athens to actually swallow. And the offer on that table was genuinely generous: autonomy, protection, a fully rebuilt city, freedom from ever facing the Persian army again. Everything a broken city could reasonably want. One elder stood to answer for the entire assembly, and what he said next became one of the most quoted refusals in all of Greek history.
Go tell Mardonius that Athens has nothing left to burn that Persia hasn't already taken, except our answer, which will always be no.
Athens said no without a second thought, and Mardonius decided almost immediately that the city would pay for that particular answer a second time. So the Persian army marched south again, and this time there was no wall of 300 Spartans waiting to slow them down at all. Athens burned for the second time in less than a single year, but by now its people had already learned the lesson well enough to flee before the first torch was even thrown. They watched their city burn from a safe distance for the second time, and this time, not one of them was even surprised by it anymore. Athens had waited weeks for Sparta to march, and one envoy finally stood up and said out loud what the entire city had been thinking all along.
Our city has burned twice while Sparta debated. March with us now,
Jesus, then.
or we will make peace with Persia ourselves.
That ultimatum finally reached Sparta, and when Sparta finally moved after hesitation, it moved with every soldier the city could spare, holding absolutely nothing back. One of Sparta's ruling ephors gave the order himself, and the historian Herodotus recorded exactly what he told the entire assembled army that morning.
Sparta marches whole, or Sparta answers for every city. Persia burns while we slept through the warning.
Pausanias personally led 5,000 full Spartan citizens north, more Spartan soldiers combined than had ever left the city in a single campaign. And that army kept growing, because more than 20 rival Greek cities, many of whom had spent generations fighting each other instead of any common enemy, sent soldiers to that same muster point. But before a single spear was raised, all of that unity meant nothing until a seer named Tisamenus could confirm the gods actually favoured this fight at all. So both armies reached Plataea and simply stopped there, each one convinced that striking first without favourable omens would doom the entire campaign before it even began. And every single morning for over a week, the omens told the Greeks the exact same thing: hold your ground and wait, no matter how badly your commanders want to advance. Mardonius had his own Greek seer reading those same signs on the other side, and the news that seer had to deliver never seemed to change either, not once.
The signs still refuse us, my lord. Attack today, and they promise only blood spilled on Greek soil.
So both exhausted sides settled for testing each other at the edges instead. Cavalry raids and skirmishes filling the silence where a real battle should have already been happening. Then one of those small skirmishes turned into something bigger when a Persian cavalry commander named MASISTIUS led his riders straight at the Greek line. Certain his golden armour made him untouchable out there, but the Athenians braced their line and refused to break, and MASISTIUS's horse took a spear meant for the animal underneath him instead. And that famous golden armour turned out to stop absolutely nothing at all, the Athenians killing him on the exact ground where his horse had fallen. Word reached Mardonius fast, and the officer carrying it clearly did not want to be the one saying it out loud.
My lord, MASISTIUS is dead. The Athenians are parading his body through their entire camp.
Then the gods have decided today wasn't the day after all.
The Greeks paraded his body deliberately through their own camp for every soldier to see. And for the first time in 8 exhausting days, morale across the entire army actually lifted. But that morale would need to last, because the hardest 8 days of this standoff was still ahead, not behind. Mardonius couldn't break the Greek line directly, so instead, he found the one thing the army actually needed, and cut it off completely: the spring that entire force depended on for water. Within days, an army of more than 100,000 men, along with every one of its horses and pack animals, was running out of water in the middle of a battlefield it could not simply abandon. And Persian cavalry cut the mountain roads, bringing food down from the north at the very same time, leaving that same enormous army thirsty, hungry, and slowly starving all at once. So Pausanias made the only decision left available to him, moving the entire army to a safer position under cover of darkness that same night. And that decision would nearly cost him everything. And moving 100,000 exhausted, thirsty men across open ground in total darkness, with no torches and no clear roads to follow, went as well as anyone honestly should have expected. One stubborn Spartan officer, named Amonpharatus, flatly refused to retreat at all that night, insisting loudly that Sparta never runs from anyone, and every man near him understood he meant it. Pausanias didn't have time to argue him out of it, so what happened between them that night was recorded exactly as short, and exactly as final, as it actually was.
I will not retreat and shame Sparta. Then stay, and pray the rest of us reach you before the Persians do.
By sunrise, the same careful formation that had held together for 8 straight days without breaking was now scattered across the field in disconnected, vulnerable pieces, and someone on the other side of that field was about to notice. Mardonius looked out at that broken formation and saw exactly what he had been waiting 8 long days to see: an enemy army that finally looked like it was retreating. So he didn't wait for a second opinion this time, and the order he gave his own men that morning has survived exactly as he shouted it.
They run before us! Take the field now, before Sparta finds its courage again!
And the full weight of that army turned toward the isolated Spartans and Tegeans, closing fast enough that reconnecting with the rest of the Greek line was already no longer even possible. With the entire Persian army now bearing straight down on his position, Pausanias' own seer, working through sacrifice after sacrifice, still refused to declare the signs favourable enough to fight back. There is no permission yet to fight back, no order yet to move, only a locked shield wall taking losses under arrow fire and waiting. Then the omens finally turned, and Pausanias gave the order every single man in that line had been waiting hours in silence to hear.
Spartans, rise! Show them why we have never once needed favorable odds to win!
The Spartan line hit those Persian wicker shields at a dead run after hours of standing still under fire, and bronze went straight through wood that had never once been built to stop it. Those shields had reliably stopped arrows across 100 years of successful Persian campaigns, but never once in that entire history had they been designed to stop a Spartan spear at close range. And step by step, the fighting turned into a grinding, shoving mess of bronze and wicker, the Persian line giving ground beneath it with every single push. Mardonius rode into the centre of his own collapsing line himself, trying to hold together with his own presence, a formation that was already coming apart around him. A Spartan soldier named Achaemenid found the opening in the chaos, and he put a stone straight into Mardonius' skull before a single guard nearby even had time to react. And the instant Mardonius fell, that entire Persian army stopped being an army at all, and became nothing more than a crowd of frightened men just trying to survive the day. On another part of that same field, Athenians had spent that entire morning killing Thebans, fellow Greeks who had chosen years earlier to fight for Persia instead of standing against it. Survivors ran desperately for the fortified wooden camp Mardonius had built weeks earlier for exactly this kind of emergency, the only shelter left standing on a battlefield that had turned completely against them. And once the Greeks broke through that wooden wall, what followed wasn't really a battle anymore. It was closer to a massacre. One Persian general named Artabazes had never trusted this battle from the very start, and what he told his own officers that morning explains exactly why he alone survived it.
This battle was lost before Mardonius ever gave the order. I will not bury 40,000 men just to prove him right.
He marched his own men away from the collapse entirely, while the rest of the army was still fighting for its life. The only Persian force at Plataea to walk home mostly intact. And if this trilogy has held your attention this far, like and subscribe now, because the ending is still worth watching unfold. Pausanias ordered Mardonius' captured cooks to prepare a full Persian feast right beside a simple Spartan meal, purely to make a point on officers.
Look at this madness. The Persians had all of this, and still marched here to steal our poverty.
And on that very same day, hundreds of miles away, another Greek force destroyed what remained of the Persian fleet at Mycale, ending the invasion on land and sea in the exact same moment. The plain of Plataea is quiet farmland today, with almost nothing left to mark the single morning that ended an empire's ambitions in Greece for good. There is no invasion left to fight, no army left to send, only the quiet certainty that this trilogy, from Thermopylae to Salamis, ended right here on this exact field. And if this story stayed with you, like and subscribe to Empires Untold.